Hey everyone, it was difficult for me to choose what topic I wanted to do. This was because there are so many things happening every day dealing with the education system. Of course, with everything going on with gun control and March for Our Lives, I did not really want to get into that. So I picked something that has been less talked about and something that most people would not know much about. The article I came across is written by Alvin Chang, who is a senior graphics designer at Vox Media. Segregation in the United States education system has been a topic of issue for a very long time, and I do not foresee it going away anytime soon. The phrase separate but equal has been used to describe segregation to mask how badly it has affected colored people. You could say segregation took a turn for the better when the case of Brown versus Board of Education was being investigated. The case was a major highlight in news during 1945 and was history made by the Supreme Court, which unanimously eliminated segregation in public schools, which in turn sparked the civil rights movement. In the Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in schools violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. However, has the segregation in schools of America really gone away, and have they actually gotten worse? The article, The Data Proves That School Segregation is Getting Worse, written by Alvin Chang, addresses this question with proven data. Throughout the article, Chang argues back at a national review written by Robert Verbruggen, who believes that it just appears segregation in schools has gotten worse. Verbruggen argues that it just looks like schools are more segregated. Throughout my presentation, I will be making several points that Chang makes throughout his article to prove Verbruggen wrong. The first point that Chang uses to prove segregation is still happening can be seen in this graph. The graph shows the percentage of black students in the South who attend schools that are 50% white. You can see in the graph that from 1989 to 2011, the percentage dropped from 44% to 23%. This graph alone provides evidence that primarily white schools have begun to have less black students in their school, which is evidence to prove that segregation is still happening. The second point Chang provides is to argue against one of Verbruggen's arguments. Verbruggen states the only reason it seems like there is more segregation is because there are just less white people in America. In the chart depicted, you can visualize what Verbruggen's conclusions were, but even if this were the case, it should not be addressed in this way. It should state that there are more minority people in the United States compared to 1970, which means that there are most likely not less white people in the United States, but there are just more minority groups. Regardless of this, to me, it is not proof that segregation just appears like it is happening. It just provides evidence that the United States is becoming more diverse. The third point is comparing isolation and unevenness when it comes to talking about segregation. Isolation is whether or not the students in a particular school have a high or low proportion of a given race. Unevenness measures how evenly distributed students of a given race are in a district. Verbruggen only looked through the lens of unevenness, which is why he comes to the conclusion that segregation has not gotten worse. He states that school segregation has not gotten worse, but rather the schools are just as unevenly distributed today as they were in the 1980s. Verbruggen then uses an example of a 90% black student distribution in a district and its schools. This would show an even distribution but a very high level of isolation, meaning the schools in the district would not be very mixed in terms of race, and the same would go for a 90% white distribution. The second example is where the school district is less even, so more unevenness, but the isolation level is lower, having a better mixed ratio. This data is proving that segregation has gotten worse because of isolation rates, not because the schools are just uneven. The fourth point that is made from Chang's article is connected to neighborhoods. The evidence proves that segregation in the education system can be linked to the segregation of neighborhoods. This has been seen since colored people have been coming to the United States. Schools had already been designated white-onlys along with the neighborhood that they were located in. This essentially forced black families to segregate into poor areas and ghettos. Unfortunately, this can still be linked to why schools are segregated today. Growing up in a poor community means that your education level is affected because, as Chang states, where you live determines where you go to school. So when we see students who are racially isolated, it's describing both underlying residential segregation and how little school districts do to ameliorate that segregation. After that point, Chang brings up the idea of charter schools. Charter schools were created to give children who do not have the money or opportunities a chance. This is why one would expect to see that charter schools are primarily filled with black and Hispanic children who come from poor families. Although not on purpose, this is segregation. Chang suggests a solution to help with eliminating segregation, and it is having students be able to go to whichever school they would like, meaning kids do not necessarily have to go to schools in just their neighborhood, which Chang illustrates for readers as proof of the difference. The last example of data is connected to the previous point. Chang mentions research that was done by Cornell sociologist Daniel Lichter that shows that the segregation between white and non-white families has changed very little since the 1980s. Cities have gotten better with segregation, but municipalities have gotten worse. Within the article was an interactive link that would show you a specific town or school district and how segregated they really are. You can see for yourself with the link provided. I personally compared a few towns. Although my town of Naugatuck, Connecticut was not available to look at, I looked at neighboring towns that I knew well. The first was Regional School District 16, or towns of Prospect and Beacon Falls. My assumption was correct that these towns would not be very diverse in black students. Prospect was a mere 5%, and Beacon Falls was 6%. Note that the lower percent means the lower number of colored people that go to that school district. Then I compared this to Longmeadow, Massachusetts and Springfield, Massachusetts. Longmeadow was similar to that of Prospect and Beacon Falls, but even less with only 3% and 4%, whereas Springfield was much more diversified with percentages ranging from 13% all the way up to 91%. The final graph I have for you shows just how more segregation happens within a single town compared to neighboring towns, which I thought was really interesting. Chang concludes by stating the following. There is proof that black and Hispanic children are being increasingly isolated in both public and charter schools. Proof that residential segregation between cities is getting worse. Proof that segregation within cities is about the same as in the 1980s. Proof that school districts are both unaware and doing nothing about the segregation. And finally, proof that when neighborhoods do not change or change drastically, the segregation gets worse. Chang gives Verbruggen some credit that even though he does not think segregation has gotten worse in the United States school system, it does not mean that the racial problems in the United States are not there and over with. With all the proof, it is clear that we are going in reverse. I will give you some of my insightful thoughts and conclusions on this article and the topic of segregation in schools. 1. Chang is correct. 2. Before reading this article, the only proof that I could think of was self-segregation that occurs in schools. Self-segregation is the separation of a religious or ethnic group from the rest of society in a state by the group itself. Through self-segregation, the members of the separate group can establish their own services and maintain their own traditions and customs, basically feeling like they're safe. 3. The students in particular who are the most affected are the ones being segregated, which are those in minority groups. There is still so much that needs to be done to stop the racial issues in the United States, but we can simply start with making sure every student feels welcome and like they are a part of the school community they are in. From the classroom discussion, I know that Rachel even says There's also some work within the residential makeup of cities to decrease rent gap between different areas based on the idea that predominantly non-white areas are predominantly less than or worse than white areas. In concluding, I believe segregation in schools is still present. I question you to think about the following mind-evoking questions. Do you think segregation has gotten better or worse in schools? Do you believe there is segregation where your hometown is? Do you believe the segregation data shown could also be influenced by self-segregation, and why? Thank you.